Everyone drinks beer. Your neighbor, your boss, the pharaohs' pyramid builders, the Sumerian priestess, the medieval monk, the men who wrote the American Constitution over tankards of ale. Beer is the most democratic beverage in human history, and the most overlooked architect of civilization itself. But here is what nobody tells you at happy hour. The story of beer is not a cheerful tavern song. It is a story of control, of empires built on barley foam, of women erased from their own invention, of moral crusades, scientific arrogance, and a 500-year-old purity law that was never really about purity at all. And it begins, as all great dark histories do, with a goddess. Before there were kings, before there were written laws, before the wheel was even a good idea, there was beer, and there was Ninkasi. Ninkasi was the Sumerian goddess of beer, not a minor deity tucked away in some forgotten temple corner, a goddess so central to daily life that her followers composed a hymn in her honor. That hymn, carved into clay tablets nearly 4,000 years ago in the cradle of civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is the oldest surviving beer recipe in the world. Ninkasi, you are the one who handles the dough with a big shovel, mixing the bapir with sweet aromatics. Bapir, a twice-baked barley bread, mixed with malted grains, soaked in water, fermented with date syrup and wild yeast. The result was not the clear golden lager in your hand today. It was a thick, cloudy, porridge-like brew, drunk through long reed straws to filter out the floating grain husks. The Sumerians drank it by the gallon, and they were not doing it for fun. They were surviving. You see, the water in ancient Mesopotamia was not safe. The Tigris and Euphrates carried silt, bacteria, and disease. But fermentation, the magical invisible work of yeast converting sugar into alcohol, killed pathogens. Beer was medicine. Beer was nutrition. Beer was liquid bread. And it was brewed almost exclusively by women. For 2,000 years, brewing belonged to priestesses, mothers, and wives. It was sacred, it was feminine, it was power. And then the men noticed. If you think you know where this story goes next, you don't. Because what happened to beer in the hands of men, empires, and moral crusaders is darker than anything the Sumerians ever imagined. Want to know how a goddess's sacred brew became a weapon of mass control? Stay with me and subscribe Wonderworld Mega. The Sumerians gave beer to the world. The Egyptians weaponized it. When we picture the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, we imagine thousands of slaves cracking under the whip. That image is wrong. The workers who built the pyramids were not slaves, they were paid laborers, and their wages were not gold, they were beer. 4 to 5 liters per day, per worker. A liquid salary poured into clay jars every morning. The Egyptians called it henket. It was thick, nutritious, slightly sweet from dates, and absolutely essential. Without beer, the pyramids do not exist. That is not a metaphor, that is logistics. The Egyptian state ran on beer. Soldiers received beer rations. Government officials received beer rations. Temple offerings to the gods included beer, because even Ra, the sun god himself, was believed to enjoy a good brew after dragging the sun across the sky. And here is the dark turn. The state that pays you in beer owns you. A worker who depends on the pharaoh's brewery for his daily nourishment cannot walk away. He cannot organize. He cannot protest. Beer was not just currency. It was control. A golden, frothy leash around the neck of an entire civilization. The Egyptians elevated brewing to an industrial scale. Massive state-run breweries churned out millions of liters. And the women who had invented the craft? They were slowly pushed to the margins. Brewing became a profession, a male profession. The priestesses of Ninkasi were replaced by foremen with quotas. The goddess was losing her grip. Fast forward 3,000 years. Europe, the Middle Ages. The Roman Empire has collapsed, and with it, much of the organized brewing knowledge of antiquity. But beer did not die. It found a new home, the monastery. Medieval monks were the craft brewers of their age, and they were astonishingly good at it. They refined the brewing process, documented recipes meticulously, and built some of the first dedicated brew houses in Europe. Monasteries like Weihenstephan in Bavaria, still operating today, have been brewing continuously since the year 1040. Let that sink in. For nearly 1,000 years, through wars, plagues, and empires rising and falling, those copper kettles never stopped. But why monks? Why did men of God become the guardians of beer? The answer is dark, practical, and deeply human. Monasteries were way stations for travelers and pilgrims. Serving beer, which was boiled during brewing and therefore safer than water, was an act of hospitality that also happened to keep the abbey's coffers full. And during Lent, when monks were forbidden from eating solid food, they drank beer. Thick, malty, calorie-dense beer. Liquid bread, just as the Sumerians had understood 4 millennia earlier. They called it flüssiges Brot, and it kept them alive through 40 days of fasting. But let us correct a popular myth. You have probably heard that medieval people drank beer instead of water because the water was too filthy. This is only half true. Medieval people absolutely drank water. They had wells, they had springs. They understood that clean water was desirable. But in crowded cities, where human waste mixed with drinking water and diseases like cholera ran rampant, beer was simply the safer option. Boiling the wort killed what the well could not. Beer did not replace water. Beer survived where water failed. And in the 9th century, monks made a discovery that would change beer forever. Hops. Before hops, beer was sweetened with herbs, a mixture called gruit, bog myrtle, yarrow, wild rosemary. Hops added bitterness, aroma, and, critically, preservation. A hopped beer could travel, it could be stored, it could be taxed. Naturally, the authorities noticed. April 23, 1516, Ingolstadt, Bavaria. Duke Wilhelm IV signs a document that will become the most famous food safety law in history, the Reinheitsgebot, the German beer purity law. Barley, hops, water. That was it. 3 ingredients. Nothing else permitted. Yeast was not even mentioned because nobody knew it existed. They called it Gott ist gut, God is good, and left it to the divine. 500 years later, German brewers still recite this law like scripture. They wrap their bottles in tradition and sell purity as a brand. But the Reinheitsgebot was never really about purity. It was about bread. You see, wheat and rye were food. Barley was not ideal for bread. It produced dense, heavy loaves. But barley made excellent beer. By restricting brewing to barley, the Duke ensured that wheat and rye stayed in the bakeries, feeding his people, while barley went into the breweries, feeding his tax revenue. The Reinheitsgebot was not a purity law. It was a price control law, a resource allocation law, a regulation disguised as tradition. And it worked. For centuries, German beer was defined by what it could not contain. Innovation was frozen. Thousands of regional beer styles, brewed with cherries, with herbs, with smoked malts, with whatever the local soil produced, were slowly wiped out or pushed underground. The law did not just regulate ingredients, it regulated imagination. But there is a twist. The Reinheitsgebot also protected Germans from some genuinely dangerous brewing practices. In other parts of Europe, brewers were adding everything from chalk to strychnine to their beer to stretch it or boost its kick. The German law, for all its cynical economic motivations, kept poison out of the tankard. A dark law, yes, but darkness with a purpose. For most of human history, brewing was local. Every village had a brewster, usually a woman continuing the ancient tradition, who made beer for her community. Recipes varied from house to house, valley to valley. Beer tasted like where it was born. The Industrial Revolution killed that. 2 inventions changed brewing more than any law or recipe ever could: the thermometer and the hydrometer. Suddenly, brewers could measure temperature precisely. They could track sugar content. They could control fermentation scientifically instead of relying on prayer and instinct. Beer became predictable, repeatable, scalable. And then came refrigeration. In 1842, in the Bohemian town of Pilsen, a Bavarian brewer named Joseph Groll combined pale malts, local Saaz hops, and the town's unusually soft water with a new technique: bottom-fermenting lager yeast, cold stored in caverns carved into the sandstone beneath the brewery. The result was a beer unlike anything the world had tasted: golden, clear, crisp, and brilliantly refreshing. Pilsner was born, and within decades, it conquered the planet. By the end of the 19th century, industrial breweries were swallowing village brew houses whole. Railroads carried kegs of standardized lager to every corner of Europe and America. The local brewster, the daughter of Ninkasi, the heir of centuries, disappeared. In her place, factories, shareholders, quarterly targets. Beer had become a commodity, and anything that becomes a commodity eventually becomes a battlefield. The temperance movement began with good intentions. Drunkenness was a genuine social plague: domestic violence, poverty, workplace accidents. Women who bore the brunt of their husbands' drinking organized, marched, and demanded change. They were right to be angry. But the movement that began with drink less became drink nothing. And the movement that began as a moral crusade became a legislative sledgehammer. January 17, 1920. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution takes effect. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors is now illegal. Overnight, one of the largest industries in America is criminalized. What happened next was predictable and devastating. Legal breweries collapsed, thousands of them, some centuries old, gone in months. In their place rose an illegal empire of gangsters, speakeasies, and bathtub gin. Al Capone built a criminal fortune on what had once been the neighborhood pub. Organized crime, already a problem, became institutionalized. The government had, with the stroke of a pen, handed the entire alcohol market to criminals. The dark irony of Prohibition is that it did not stop drinking. Americans drank more, they just drank worse. Industrial alcohol was poisoned by the government, literally, deliberately, with methanol, in an effort to deter bootleggers. An estimated 10,000 people died from drinking that poisoned alcohol. The state killed its own citizens to prove a moral point. In 1933, Prohibition was repealed. The experiment was declared a catastrophic failure, but the damage was permanent. When the breweries reopened, most were owned by a handful of corporations. The diversity of American beer, hundreds of regional styles, local specialties, immigrant traditions, had been erased. What returned was a monoculture of pale, fizzy, nearly identical lagers. Beer had survived the moral crusade, but it came out the other side stripped of its soul. If the 20th century was beer's long winter, the thaw began in a most unlikely place, a struggling San Francisco brewery called Anchor. In 1965, Fritz Maytag, yes, of the washing machine Maytags, bought a failing brewery that made a strange, cloudy, intensely flavored beer called Anchor Steam. At the time, there were fewer than 100 breweries in the entire United States. Most Americans had never tasted anything other than mass-produced lager. Fritz Maytag did not just save a brewery, he planted a flag. Then came 1978. President Jimmy Carter signed a bill legalizing homebrewing at the federal level. It was a small piece of legislation, barely noticed at the time, but it lit a fuse. Across the country, in garages and basements and kitchen corners, people started brewing again, experimenting, sharing bottles with neighbors, reviving recipes that had been dead for half a century. The craft beer revolution was not an industry trend. It was a rebellion against the idea that beer should taste like nothing, a rebellion against the corporations that had decided what Americans were allowed to drink, a rebellion that said, beer belongs to the people who make it, not the shareholders who sell it. By the 1990s, the movement had exploded. Microbreweries, brew pubs, nano-breweries, the language itself was being rewritten. America went from fewer than 100 breweries in 1978 to over 9,000 today. More breweries than at any point in human history. More styles, more experimentation, more connection between brewer and drinker than ever before. And here is the ghost in the mash tune. The women who were pushed out of brewing 2,000 years ago. They are back. Women are the fastest growing demographic in craft beer, as brewers, as owners, as industry leaders. The daughter of Ninkasi, after 4 millennia of exile, has reclaimed her place at the kettle. Beer is a mirror. Every civilization that has ever existed has brewed it. Every empire has tried to control it. Every moral panic has tried to ban it. And every time, it has returned. Not because people demand intoxication, but because beer is something deeper than alcohol. It is community, poured into a glass. It is 4,000 years of human ingenuity, fermented and carbonated and served cold. The Sumerians understood this. They gave beer a goddess because they knew it was sacred. The Egyptians understood this. They built the pyramids on it. The monks understood this. The homebrewers of the 1970s understood this. Everyone drinks beer, but now you know, beer has also been drinking you, your history, your politics, your morality, your science, your rebellion, for longer than any empire has stood. The next time you raise a glass, you are not just drinking. You are continuing a story that began with a hymn to a goddess in a land between 2 rivers, when the world was young and beer was magic.